and the regional challenge of North Korea. The economic ties have invested the United States, I think, far more deeply in that relationship than would otherwise be the case. But I still think that it is, in ways, if I can use this, and I'll be happy to back off of it later, but in an instrumental sense. The United States sees this as a relationship that it can use or hopes to use around the world. The other two partners of the United States, I think, have much more regionally focused foreign policies, and yet with both hopes and pretensions to playing a larger global role, which I think is an interesting question at some point to ask, why do countries feel they need to play a global role? What's the return on investment? What do you really get out of it? What we see is that often the desire to play a global role comes with responsibilities that I'm not sure national governments have always thought about, or the anticipation of responsibilities that national governments have not always thought about. And when the time comes due to pay that check, things get a little bit more rough, and the consensus that may have existed about why we want to play a global role becomes more muddy and begins to break down. And I think what you can see in some ways is a flip between the role that Japan hoped that it would play globally in the past decade and a half, and where we are today with President Lee and his visions for a global Korea. Obviously, for Korea, the main concern is North Korea, and will remain so until that situation is resolved, however it is resolved, in order, of course, to be able to respond in any credible way to that. The U.S.-Korean alliance and the U.S.-Korea relationship has been the bedrock of most of Korea's foreign policy in the post-war period. Where we are today, I think, in a truly interesting and I hope significant and important change, is President Lee's vision to play a much more global role, the global Korea idea. There is, I think, in statecraft a point where the concreteness, the specificity of policy obviously has to be laid out in a way that allows it to ultimately be acted upon. But absent that, or not even absent that, short of that, the issue of global confidence, so to speak, is one that actually carries countries quite a far way in terms of playing a more significant role, and certainly being seen as a type of partner to engage with. And that's exactly where I think President Lee has brought Korea today. In some ways, I would say it's the exact mirror image of what you've seen in Japan. If you look at Japan's overall global activities and commitment over the past 2 or 3 decades, it is not insignificant. Billions of dollars in overseas development aid, participation in all major multilateral initiatives, close coordination with the U.S. on security issues as far as is allowed by Constitution and the like. But I would argue there has been a lack of the confidence on the part of Japanese leaders to really feel comfortable with that global role. And in America, at least, I think, we were somewhat misled, let's say, by Prime Minister Koizumi in the earlier part of this decade, who really did have a confidence and had what I think was less an articulated vision of Japan's role in the world, and much more a gut sense of where he wanted Japan to be and what he wanted it to do, that made Japan punch above its weight for a period. And once he was gone, you very quickly saw that sense of confidence, and I think the expectations of Japan playing a larger role collapse. So I think that's where, in a way, President Lee is today, and yet he has followed with some significant policy initiatives that I will mention in a second. For Japan, very briefly, just to wrap up this first section before I move into the other parts of my talk. The confidence that Korea feels is something that I think Japanese are increasingly nostalgic for. The general vision, I think, on the part of Japanese leaders is not only an overall sense of frustration as to why they do not seem to be able to get traction to play the global role that they hope, and also solve the myriad domestic problems they have, but also how to maintain relevance. There really is, I think, the sense that Japan still, or throughout this year, maybe the world's second largest economy, so it'll be the third largest economy for 20, 30 years. Why it is not able at least in a public sense, to be maintaining the relevance that you would think naturally would accrue to Japan. This, I think, feeds in somewhat to the policies of the DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan, to try and, I would not argue break away from the United States, but expand the portfolio of Japan's global interests very clearly through engaging China more and getting more involved in multilateral organizations. I think the irony is Japan's already been doing that. I don't think there's anything new in that, and I think you go back to 1972, Prime Minister Tanaka rushed to normalize relations with China as soon as President Nixon had left China. The Southeast Asia Initiative throughout the 1970s, the engagement with multilateral organizations, it's all been there. I don't think there's anything new here. The rhetoric might be new, and I think those of us in Washington who need things to write about or think about, want to latch onto certain words and say this is the end of the world, but I don't see that there's much different. So the foreign policies of each of the countries, I think, are at base very, very steady, and yet are responding around the edges and creeping inwards towards the center to variety of changes within that post-Cold War context that I started talking about at the beginning. So where do they have shared regional initiatives? If we presume that for Korea and Japan, and then by extension the Korea-U.S. relationship and the Japan-U.S. relationship, that it will be centered on Asia, what are the shared initiatives? I would say that the best indication of what would be well, at least to me, let's put it this way, a natural development in this set of relations actually was coming out of the early attempts to deal with North Korea before the six-party talks really ginned up, and that was the TCOG, the Trilateral Coordination and Oversight Group, that they were attempting with a very specific crisis issue to nonetheless say that the hub-and-spoke set of relationships that had guided U.S. foreign policy and alliance relations for the past 45 years or so needed to naturally expand. Again, I think if you look historically, certainly since the 1980s and beyond, as Korea liberalized the political system and became a fully functioning democracy, a fully functioning liberal society, that Japan and Korea have become far more like each other than dissimilar, and that is not to discount any of the historical issues, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But if you look broadly, the two societies that are based on the rule of law, that are consumer oriented, that are highly skilled, that are liberal, that engage both with the United States and regionally, I think over time, and maybe against current public opinion even potentially, will find more and more commonality of interest, a shared community of interests that will naturally bring them together. Now that can be spiked, or it can be, spiked is not the word, negative, it can be supercharged in a way by crises like North Korea. But I think that you would have found over time, as if you just look at other similar analogous situations around the world, that there would be a growth in this shared sense of community. Obviously, historical questions have to be answered. There has to be a much deeper sense of trust and the like. But in terms of policy, I think the two have grown over with far more in common than they have dissimilarly over the past decade. So how does that fit in with the United States? Again, I think the United States view was very much based on the traditional security concerns. It was easy for the United States to engage the two in a TCOG mechanism, transfer that over to the six-party talks and the like, because that fit into a very clear channel for U.S. security policy. Everything else, though, was done again bilaterally. The U.S., I think, missed great opportunities to try to more fully form a trilateral relationship. When I've traveled through Korea, when I've traveled to Japan, I have heard repeatedly in private conversations, I'm sure most of you have, or at least I hope most of you have, that both sides want a deeper trilateral relationship. Meaning, I hope they weren't just telling me that because I was, putting that out on the table. That's what I've heard, and I've heard it enough that it made me then think that the U.S., for whatever sets of reasons, and we could speculate, did not take an initiative. And I think because of the